Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to bring you my May wrap-up. May was Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, so in honor of that I chose to exclusively read books by Asian Pacific American authors. Although there was one exception, which we'll talk about when we get there, but it was a buddy read that was planned months in advance. The first book I listened to in May was Want by Cindy Pon, read by Roger Ye. This is an Own Voices story about Jason Zhao, who lives in a futuristic Taiwan where society is basically divided into two classes, the Yos and the Meis. To be Yo means to have, so that applies to those with wealth and privilege, and to be Mei means to be without, referring to the impoverished lower class. So in this futuristic version of Taipei, pollution has become a very serious, life-threatening issue, so much so that these special high-tech suits have been created to circulate clean air through the body. But of course, they're only accessible to those who can afford them, which means many Meis are dying from serious illnesses. Jason Zhao is Mei, and he's also been orphaned because of these terrible living conditions. Together with his small gang of tech-savvy friends, he begins to suspect that one of Taipei's most lucrative companies, Jin Corp, may actually be reinforcing or creating the pollution itself in order to sell more suits. So Jason and his friends come up with a simple solution. They plan to steal a bunch of money, try and pass Jason off as a Yo in order to infiltrate Jin Corp, and pull off a huge heist to shut them down for good. This is a great book if you're looking for a unique heist story that has social commentary, diverse characters, and a non-Western viewpoint. It's really fast-paced, full of drama, intrigue, action, a little bit of enemy seduction, which are all things I enjoy very much. It's also really cool to read a story that's conscious of environmentalism and that speaks about how we have to be wary of those who would capitalize on fear and health risks, and how important it is to differentiate between solutions that are for good and solutions that are for now. Another compelling element is Jason's assimilation into the Yo way of life. It's very easy for him to get comfortable with having all these resources at his disposal. It's easy for him to get used to living in that suit and breathing clean air at every moment. Everything about his life immediately improves. And with that privilege comes an easy road towards complacency, and you kind of see him falling prey to that as the story goes on. It's something that he has to actively work against. So it's high octane, high risk, full of action and really cool tech, but it's also got a lot of thoughtfulness. I did kind of feel like this group achieved their milestones a little too easily, but the interesting thing is that there's kind of an explanation for why that is built into the story itself, so I do appreciate that. For me, things just wrapped up a little too quickly. The high tension dissolved pretty fast, so there could be a cutoff point and a lead-in for book 2, but I will definitely be reading that sequel, and for this one I settled on 3.5 stars. After that, I finally read Since You Asked by Maureen Gu. This is Own Voices YA about a Korean-American teenager named Holly who is just fed up with her big, always in your business, your best is never good enough Korean family, and who's just frustrated that high school isn't as great as everyone says. She works on the school newspaper as a copy editor, and one day, as a joke to entertain herself, she sort of vandalizes this article submitted by an upperclassman about the optimism a new school year brings. Obviously, to Holly, that's total bullshit, but she would never actually say that out loud. Little does she know, at the end of that day, she accidentally submits the wrong article, her vandalized version, to be printed. She gets a ton of crap from her peers and from the administration about it, but because so many students are actually reading the paper, which never happens, Holly somehow ends up with her own opinion article where she can, for better or worse, write whatever she wants. I think this story's strong point is how Holly explores that in her experience as an Asian American, she was taught to value the importance of fostering a positive image at all costs. This sort of ties in with the model minority myth, and as an outspoken teen, Holly is realizing that you just can't please everyone, but at the same time, she was taught not to make waves. Because she now has this article, a way to openly express herself, even the less marketable parts, she's realizing that speaking out and speaking your mind can also be a way to connect with others, even if it's at the cost of alienating the haters. So even though she's easily frustrated with her family, with the social hierarchy of high school, she's slowly making her way towards expressing a truer self. Along with that thread, I would definitely say the exploration of the mother-daughter relationship in this story is also a strong point. Holly's mother kind of opposes everything she loves and values on principle, but as the story goes on, you kind of see that it could just be that she expresses her love and her pride in a way that's different. Not more, not less, just different. That said, this book feels like a debut because there's often a lack of driving force. I thought the newspaper article was going to be the main source of conflict because blatantly speaking your mind and publicly being crass goes against everything Holly's family wants, but that kind of faded into the background with a lot of other threads. I was literally shocked when this book ended because it just cut off so abruptly when I did not expect it. There was little to no closure. I turned that last page and I didn't understand why I was suddenly looking at the acknowledgements. I've never had that experience, but I just felt like the story wasn't quite ready to end, which is indicative of how I felt overall about the structure of this book. So while I flew through this, really enjoyed myself, and had a couple of great laughs, it did lack a bit of polish, and I think it could have been even more impactful than it was. So I settled on 3 stars. Then I read The Red Threads of Fortune and The Black Tides of Heaven, respectively, by J.Y. Yang. These are companion fantasy novellas about a set of twins, Makoya and Akeha, and each novella follows the perspective of one of the twins. It's also worth mentioning that the author J.Y. Yang is non-binary, and they've created the society where children are not assigned gender at birth. Once they grow up and learn about themselves, they can choose a gender or they can decline to choose. And that definitely is present in the story, probably more so in The Black Tides of Heaven, which is from Akeha's perspective and focuses more on the twins' early life. Akeha and Makoya are actually children of the Protectorate, who's basically the highest authority in the region, but when they were young, their mother sent them away to be raised in a monastery because to her they weren't really of use. As they grow up, they end up choosing different genders and begin to grow apart, but each of them in their own way is constantly working towards preventing war at the hands of their mother from breaking out. In this world, there's 2 factions involved in the war efforts: the Tensors, who use a kind of magic to manipulate and navigate what is called the Slack, and the Machinists, who are inventing technology and weapons for people who are not connected to the Slack. And basically Makoya is a Tensor and Akeha is a Machinist, so they're divided by philosophy and lifestyle as well. I really love the entire aesthetic of these novellas, the cultural backdrop, the upheaval of societal norms, the unique magic system, the focus on dismantling corruption. It's all fantastic. People always ask which order to read these in, but because they're each independent, standalone narratives, there's really no wrong way. And actually I kind of love the way I read them, Red Threads first and Black Tides second, because it's backwards chronologically, and I think that brought out so much more texture and depth. It was jarring and exciting to be introduced to all these excellent established characters and dynamics in Red Threads, and then to sort of unravel that backwards and uncover how everything started. Even though these were short, I just felt like I got so much out of the world and the characters because everyone involved has experienced trauma and loss at the hands of a corrupt empire, and they're searching for a way to bring that system to an end. I especially felt for Makoya, who's extremely traumatized and depressed, and she recognizes that she can't just return to her life, that time doesn't heal every wound, and that she has to take action for herself in a way that feels right. But both novellas explore how the only way to break vicious cycles is to do things different. There's no rule book when it comes to evolution and growth. Both Makoya and Akeha have to set aside what they were taught and go to new places if they hope to make a difference. Whether it's folding the slack or manipulating machines, the only way that's gonna work is a different way. Also, both Makoya and Akeha are hella queer, and it's so good. I really enjoyed these, and I'm so looking forward to the next installment. I gave these respectively 4.5 and 4 stars. Then I had my sort of buddy read with Saajid from Books on My Social Life, and together we were supposed to read Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, which I listened to as an audiobook read by Morven Christie. Before I continue, I say supposed to because Saajid and I just didn't sync up as planned. He was really busy after finishing his whole ass degree, and I believe I ended up finishing the book and he did not, but that's okay. This story is historical fiction. It's set in Iceland in 1829 and explores the final days of Agnes Magnusdóttir, who was accused of murder and sentenced to execution, and I believe she was the last person to be executed in Iceland. While the government officials decide on a date and method for her execution, Agnes is ordered to stay with a local family on their farm as a work hand, and obviously they're less than excited to host an accused convict. And in the meantime, the court has ordered that Agnes be overseen by a local priest who is supposed to guide her towards forgiveness and help her prepare spiritually for her death. So she gets paired up with this really young, nervous, inexperienced priest named Todi, who she actually requested for herself. And now he's the only one who will listen to her story and allow her to explain in her own words, in her own time, whether she committed this murder or not. This story was so atmospheric, darkly enticing, beautiful yet melancholic, but I was surprised by how invested I became in these characters. There are so many moving parts and layers to this story, and I think that's what makes it so powerful, despite the fact that its strength lies in how quiet and subtle the buildup is. You get all these different perspectives, not just from Agnes, but from her host family, the young priest, and you even get these official dispatches from government officials between chapters. That small detail especially adds so much because you're very close to this character who's waiting for their death, and then that's broken up by these officials corresponding about how much they're willing to pay for the execution weapon and how much they're going to sell the possessions of the accused for once the sentence is carried out. That business-like indifference, that distance, gives you another perspective. And speaking of distance, I like how the perspective changes depending on who is the focus. The host family, the priest, the officials, that's all third-person perspective, but when Agnes is telling her own story and exploring her own feelings, it's first-person perspective. I think that brings out a kind of emotional dynamicism we would have otherwise missed, because suddenly everything becomes real and personal and close, which is a stark contrast to the other perspectives which are more removed and distant. But most importantly, I like that the story wasn't created for us to judge Agnes's guilt or innocence. In a way, it's about retroactively restoring Agnes's dignity, which is something I talked about in relation to Cersei. It's about someone like Toady realizing that there's value and significance to Agnes's experiences, and taking the time to listen to those experiences is a sign of respect, which is something Agnes is sorely lacking in every other area of her life. Especially because of the time period, I think what you find is that you have a woman who's just trying to make the best of limited choices that sometimes are not actually choices. In sort of a literal sense, there are choices you can live with and choices you can't, and that's what I felt this story was really about. It's a complex, emotional look at a woman's choices. So I was really taken with this story, as everyone predicted, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then my poetry collection for the month was Recombinant by Ching-In Chen. This is a really complex collection that examines the erasure of Asian communities, especially when it comes to immigrants and those who experience labor smuggling and trafficking, and then attempts to recreate and repurpose that history in powerful ways. I think to fully understand this collection, you have to internalize the definition of recombination, which is actually a scientific term referring to rearranging genetic material, crossing over chromosomes, and artificially joining segments of DNA from different organisms. The structure of the poems themselves actually imitate this idea, because from one line to the next, there's these seemingly unrelated, jarring, out-of-context ideas that are mishmashed together to create something new. In terms of form, this collection often mimics a sort of registry or ledger, especially in relation to immigrants and how their skills, age, sex, and language abilities were recorded in a way that was very impersonal and detached. So it is sometimes difficult to process or access, especially when you're close to it, but then because it's breaking the rules, there is that sense of reclamation and righting past wrongs. And it's also important to note that this collection visually prioritizes and privileges white space, which is very much an intentional statement, especially in this context. Overall, I was impressed with this collection, even though it definitely wasn't the easiest thing to process, and I gave it 4 stars. And finally, I rounded out the month with a fantastic short story collection, Sorry Please Thank You by Charles Yu, who wrote one of my all-time favorite books, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe. All of these stories have some element of sci-fi. There's speculative fiction, there's metafiction, there's Yu's trademark dry humor and his knack for tapping into acute kinds of sadness, and it's all great. There's such a wide range of stories, from a story about an emotional engineer who gets paid to experience other people's bad days, to a video game hero who realizes he might not be in control of his own life. I'm just gonna quote my own Goodreads review and say that the combined forces of Charles Yu's intellect and talent would be scary if it weren't so flat out good. This collection knocked me on my ass, and I don't even like short stories. That's as real as it gets. Charles Yu continues to impress me in the way he singles out all those tiny individual moments of self-doubt, of self-loathing, those little strains of misery we've incorporated in our day-to-day lives. But it's not all sadness and feeling pathetic. His writing is hilarious and quirky, and he brings levity to those moments. He's able to highlight them because of these weird, interesting concepts. And every time I read him, I get fucked up, because he makes you question the cycles you're stuck in and the very nature of your actions and what you want. Do you want what you want because you genuinely want it for yourself, or because you've been conditioned to think that you want it? I read his fiction and I'm like, Charles, I just don't know. That's sort of the common thread that holds this collection together, because these characters all have mediocre expectations for their lives, and they're realizing that they have the means to reach for more, to reach for something else. And it's an exploration of what stops us from doing that. I could talk about Charles Yu and his writing for hours, but suffice to say this collection just further solidified his place as one of my favorites, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So those are all the books I read in the month of May. If you've read any of them yourself and have thoughts to share, I would love to hear from you in the comments. But that's everything I have for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.